I was halfway through a polished conversation with the head of global partnerships when my phone buzzed against the marble-topped table. A message from my boss. Congratulations, Rowena. We've decided to promote Amanda instead of you. She's a better cultural fit. No greeting, no explanation, just that. I didn't need to look up to know where he was. Daniel Hayes, Regional Director of Virex Consulting, stood across the ballroom, champagne glass raised, laughing with executives like he'd just closed a major deal instead of quietly dismantling a decade of my work. For a split second, everything inside me went still, not broken, not angry, just clear. The music hummed softly under the crystal chandeliers. Conversations blurred into background noise. I placed my phone face down, lifted my glass for one final sip, then set it aside with deliberate calm. "Excuse me," I said, smiling politely as I stepped away. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I crossed the room, steady, measured, intentional. Each step felt less like a reaction and more like a decision that had already been made long before tonight. When I reached Daniel, he turned toward me, still smiling. "Rowena," he said casually, as if nothing had just happened. Enjoying the evening, I held his gaze and returned a small, controlled smile. "I am," I replied. Then I reached into my clutch and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, thick, neatly sealed. "Thank you for the opportunity." He took it, confusion flickering across his face. But the smile stayed. He hadn't opened it yet. He didn't understand. No one did, because what they thought was a last-minute decision was something I had been preparing for a long time. If you're curious about what's going to happen next, keep watching and consider subscribing if you truly believe in justice. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Before we continue, just a quick note: this is a fictional story, with some elements enhanced by AI to make it more vivid and emotionally engaging. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. I joined Virex Consulting when I was 29, fresh out of a failed startup that had drained everything I had: time, savings, and a good portion of my confidence. I told myself I needed stability, something structured, something predictable. Virexon seemed like the perfect place to rebuild. What I didn't expect was how quickly I would become indispensable. Within my first year, I rebuilt a failing client retention model that increased renewal rates by over 30%. By year 3, I was leading strategic analysis for multi-million-dollar accounts. By year 5, most of the company's high-risk contracts quietly passed through my hands before anyone else even saw them. I didn't just analyze problems, I solved them before they escalated. I created forecasting systems that replaced outdated manual processes, cutting project delays nearly in half. I designed workflow structures that allowed teams to operate with precision instead of chaos. Clients didn't always know my name, but they felt the impact of my work in every successful delivery. And internally, people knew. They came to me when numbers didn't make sense, when timelines broke down, when leadership needed answers but didn't know the right questions to ask. I became the person behind the results, the one who made things work when nothing else did. But none of that translated into recognition, because while I was building systems, Amanda was building relationships. She showed up to every social event, laughed at the right moments, remembered birthdays, organized team lunches. She didn't outwork me, she didn't outperform me, but she made people feel comfortable, and somewhere along the way, that started to matter more than results. I watched as ideas I had presented in closed meetings resurfaced weeks later, repackaged, simplified, delivered with a brighter smile and softer tone. Suddenly, they were fresh perspectives. Suddenly, they were hers. I told myself it didn't matter. That performance would speak for itself. That eventually, the numbers would be too undeniable to ignore. I was wrong. Because in a room where perception outweighs substance, the person who builds the engine is rarely the one who gets credit for driving it. 3 months before the gala, I sat across from Daniel in a glass-walled conference room for my annual performance review. The city stretched out behind him, all sharp lines and quiet ambition, a view I used to find motivating. That day, it felt distant, almost irrelevant. I had come prepared. As always, a full breakdown of performance metrics, year-over-year growth, client retention improvements, projected revenue gains tied directly to the systems I had built. Every number told the same story. I wasn't just contributing. I was driving the company forward. Daniel skimmed the first page, then set the report aside like it was optional reading. "Rowena, your work is strong," he said, leaning back in his chair. "No one's questioning that." There was a pause, just long enough to signal what was coming next. But I stayed silent, waiting. "You have a tendency to come across as intense," he continued. "Direct. Sometimes that can be hard for people." I held his gaze. Hard for people, or hard for leadership? He gave a small, dismissive smile. "Let's not frame it that way. This is about team dynamics." "And Amanda?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "She connects with people," he said quickly. "She brings a certain energy. People respond to that. She makes the room feel lighter. She also lost us the Creston account," I replied, "and delayed 2 major deliverables last quarter." Daniel waved his hand slightly, as if brushing away something insignificant. "Outcomes can be managed. What people remember is how you make them feel." That was the moment everything clicked. Not gradually, not painfully, instantly. It didn't matter how accurate my models were, how efficient my systems became, or how many contracts I saved. None of it outweighed comfort. None of it competed with likability. I closed my folder slowly, not out of frustration, but out of clarity. "Understood," I said, and I meant it, because in that moment, I realized I had been trying to win in a system that was never designed to reward people like me. I didn't argue after that meeting. I didn't push back. Didn't try to defend my value. Didn't ask for another chance to prove what was already measurable. Instead, I did something far more important. I started preparing my exit. What no one at Virexon knew was that for nearly a year, I had been building something of my own, quietly, carefully, on nights and weekends, on my own servers, using tools and frameworks that had nothing to do with company resources. It started as a question I couldn't ignore. What if strategy didn't just rely on static data, but adapted in real time based on how teams actually behaved, not just numbers on a dashboard, but patterns in decision-making, communication, execution speed? I began mapping workflows against human behavior, creating a system that could anticipate friction before it happened. What I built became something far bigger than I initially intended, a fully adaptive operational model that aligned tasks, talent, and timing with precision. It didn't just optimize performance, it redefined how teams functioned under pressure. I called it Synapse Flow, 2 months before the gala. I finalized the intellectual property registration under my own name. Every line of logic, every structural layer, every predictive model, it was mine, legally protected, independently developed, and completely separate from Virexon. At the same time, I had been in quiet discussions with a smaller firm based in Seattle, Halcyon Strategy Group. They weren't the biggest name in the industry, but they were sharp, data-driven, and more importantly, open to new thinking. Our first conversation was supposed to be a casual coffee meeting. It turned into a working session, then a pilot program, then weekly strategy calls. They didn't ask me to soften my approach. They didn't question my tone or suggest I be less intense. They asked about scalability, implementation, impact. They saw what I was building for what it actually was. By the time the gala arrived, the pilot had already exceeded expectations. Internal metrics showed performance gains that Virexon had never come close to achieving. And more importantly, my next move was no longer a possibility. It was already in motion. The morning after the gala, the announcement went live. Halcyon Strategy Group proudly welcomed me as their new partner of strategic systems. The release was clean, precise, and impossible to ignore. It highlighted Synapse Flow as a breakthrough in adaptive workflow intelligence. already delivering measurable results across multiple pilot teams. By the time most people at Virexon opened their inboxes, the shift had already begun. What they didn't realize, not immediately, was what my resignation actually meant beyond a title change, because the envelope I handed Daniel the night before wasn't just a polite exit. It included a full withdrawal notice of all independently developed systems, models, and operational frameworks that had never been contractually assigned to the company. In simple terms, everything I built was leaving with me. At exactly 9 a.m., my access was formally terminated. At 9:01, every automated workflow tied to my architecture stopped functioning. Not abruptly, not destructively, but completely. Forecasting dashboards stopped updating. Workflow triggers failed to execute. Internal tracking systems reverted to outdated manual processes that no one had touched in years. What once felt seamless now required hours of reconstruction, assuming anyone even understood how to begin. By mid-morning, confusion spread across departments. Emails started circulating, quiet at first, then increasingly urgent. Has anyone checked the forecasting pipeline? Why are client deliverables not syncing? Who has access to Rowena's system? No one did. Because there was no company system. There was only mine. Layered quietly beneath everything they thought was standard infrastructure. Amanda arrived late that morning, confident, composed, carrying the title she had just been given. She walked into the weekly check-in meeting with a rehearsed smile, ready to lead. But leadership requires understanding. And as questions started coming in, one after another, it became clear she didn't even know where to begin. By noon, the tone inside Virexon had shifted completely. What had been a celebration just hours before was now something else entirely. Something unstable, something unraveling. By Wednesday, the first client emails started coming in. They were polite at first, controlled, professional, just checking in on this week's forecast update. Noticing a delay in the delivery timeline, can you confirm status? Then the tone began to shift. We're experiencing unexpected inconsistencies. Is there an issue on your end? Each message carried the same underlying question. Even if it wasn't explicitly stated, what happened to the system that used to work inside Virexon? No one had a clear answer. Amanda tried to manage the situation the only way she knew how. She scheduled quick sync meetings, reassured clients with vague promises, copied Daniel on every reply to create the illusion of control. She used words like realignment and transition phase, hoping language could buy time, but time only exposed the gaps. There was no realignment. There was no transition plan. There were just scattered spreadsheets, disconnected processes, and a team trying to rebuild something they had never fully understood in the first place. The analysts, the ones who used to rely on the automated triggers and predictive flags, were now working late into the night, manually tracking data that used to update itself. Mistakes started slipping through. Deadlines began to blur. Small delays turned into missed commitments, and clients noticed. By Friday, 3 major accounts had escalated their concerns directly to Daniel. One paused an upcoming contract renewal. Another requested a full performance review. The third, more quietly, began exploring alternative partners. The internal pressure was building faster than anyone could contain it. Daniel stopped smiling in meetings. His tone sharpened, his patience thinning with every report that didn't add up. He asked for updates, for solutions, for accountability. But every answer circled back to the same problem. The system was gone. And with it, the stability they had taken for granted. For the first time, the weight of his decision began to settle in, not as a minor oversight, but as a costly mistake. While Virexon struggled to stay afloat, I was stepping into a completely different reality. Halcyon didn't feel like a company trying to impress itself. It felt focused, efficient. Every conversation had a purpose. Every meeting led to action. There were no empty compliments, no performative enthusiasm, just clarity. In my first week, I was asked a simple question. How fast can we scale this? Not can it work? Not will people like it, just results. By the second week, Synapse Flow was already being tested across multiple teams. We started with internal operations, mapping workflow behaviors, identifying friction points, and adjusting execution patterns in real time. The data responded almost immediately. Project timelines shortened, communication gaps narrowed, decision-making became faster, sharper, more precise. By week 3, the system was no longer a pilot. It was a rollout. Halcyon's leadership didn't hesitate. They pushed for cross-department integration, expanding Synapse Flow into client-facing operations. I led strategy sessions with teams that didn't need convincing. They saw the impact firsthand. Healthcare clients reported faster coordination between departments. Retail teams improved inventory forecasting accuracy. Manufacturing partners reduced delays across multi-phase production cycles. The numbers spoke clearly. Performance gains weren't incremental. They were exponential. And for the first time in years, I wasn't being asked to adjust myself to fit the room. The room adjusted to the work. No one told me to soften my tone. No one suggested I be more approachable. They asked for precision, and they trusted me to deliver it. One afternoon, during a leadership review, the COO looked directly at me and said, "You didn't just build a tool, you built an advantage." That was the difference. At Virexon, I had been tolerated. At Halcyon, I was valued. And the momentum I was building wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating. The message came on a Tuesday morning from a number I hadn't saved, but didn't need to. Daniel Hayes, Rowena. We need to talk today. It's important. No greeting. No attempt at casual conversation. Just urgency. Stripped of its usual polish. I saw it between 2 meetings and locked my phone without replying. Not out of spite, but because I no longer operated on his timeline. My day was structured around strategy calls, deployment reviews, and a licensing discussion that could expand Synapse Flow into international markets, whatever crisis Virexon was facing. It wasn't mine to manage anymore. By the time I opened the message again that evening, 3 more had followed. "Please call me. This is time-sensitive. We're facing some challenges." I almost smiled at that last one. Challenges, a carefully chosen word for something much bigger. I responded with a single line. "I have 15 minutes tomorrow at 9:30. Your move." He called at 9:31. The difference in his voice was immediate. The confidence, the casual authority he used to carry, was gone, replaced by something tighter, controlled, but strained. "Rowena. Thank you for making time," he began. "I'll be direct. Things haven't gone as expected." I leaned back, letting the silence stretch just enough. "In what way?" I asked. He exhaled. "The systems you implemented were more integrated than we realized. We're experiencing operational instability." There it was. Not acknowledgement. Not yet, but close. Amanda hasn't been able to replicate the performance. He continued carefully. I didn't interrupt. Which part? I asked after a pause. The logic, or the execution? He hesitated. Both, for a moment. Neither of us spoke. Then he shifted to the real reason for the call. "We'd like to explore a partnership, a licensing agreement for your system. We're prepared to offer compensation, competitive terms." His words kept going, but I had already heard enough. This wasn't about recognition. This was about damage control. And the difference mattered, because the moment you stop needing someone to see your value is the moment their validation loses its power completely. The proposal arrived 2 days later, a formal document, polished and precise, stamped with Virexon's logo and addressed directly to me. They weren't asking anymore. They were offering a full licensing agreement for Synapse Flow, multi-year contract, 7-figure compensation package, strategic advisory role attached. On the surface, it looked generous, but the moment I reached the final page, I closed it. Non-disclosure, non-compete, ownership clauses buried under legal language that all pointed to the same intention. Control. They didn't just want access to what I built. They wanted to contain it. They still didn't understand. I printed the document and sat with it for a few minutes before making my decision. Not whether to accept it, but how to respond. I agreed to meet, neutral ground, a private business lounge overlooking the river, far from their offices, far from the environment where they once held all the leverage. Daniel arrived early. He stood when I approached, a gesture he had never extended before. His expression was different now, less polished, more careful. "Rowena, thank you for coming," he said. "Let's get to it," I replied. Taking my seat, he launched into a familiar pitch. Strategic alignment, mutual benefit, long-term collaboration. The language hadn't changed, only the urgency behind it had. When he finished, I slid the printed proposal back across the table. "You want the system," I said calmly. "But this isn't about money." He frowned slightly. "Then what are you asking for? Accountability?" The word settled between us. I leaned forward just enough to make my point clear. "You publicly acknowledge that Synapse Flow was created, developed, and implemented by me. By name. In your client communications and shareholder reports." His reaction was immediate. Surprise, hesitation, calculation. "That's unconventional," he said carefully. "So was promoting someone who didn't build the system she was credited for." I replied. Silence followed. Then I added, "This isn't a negotiation about price. It's a correction of the narrative. Because once the truth is documented, it can't be rewritten to fit someone else's comfort." The statement was published 12 days later, not buried, not hidden in fine print. Page 3 of Virexon's quarterly shareholder report, followed by a direct mention in their client newsletter. The wording was careful, but unmistakable. They acknowledged that the operational system previously referred to as an internal innovation had, in fact, been conceived, developed, and implemented by me, Rowena Chase, former senior strategic analyst. It wasn't an apology, but it was the truth. And once the truth is made public, it changes everything, within days. The industry responded. Messages started appearing in my inbox from professionals I had never spoken to. People who had seen the announcement and connected the dots. Some were brief, others more personal, but they all carried the same realization. They hadn't known how much of the success had come from me. Now they did. Back at Virexon, the damage didn't stop. Client confidence continued to erode. Projects slowed. Internal turnover increased as more employees began to question decisions that once went unchallenged. The structure I had built wasn't something they could easily replace. And without it, the cracks only widened. Amanda stepped down quietly a few weeks later. No announcement beyond a short internal memo. No celebration. No acknowledgement of what had gone wrong. Daniel lasted a little longer, but not much. Leadership changes followed, framed as strategic restructuring, though everyone understood what it really meant. When results disappear, narratives don't hold for long. Meanwhile, at Halcyon, everything continued to grow. Synapse Flow expanded across new markets, scaled into international operations, and became a core advantage in every partnership we built. I was offered a new role, Executive Vice President of Systems and Innovation, not as a gesture, but as a necessity, because the work demanded it. Months later, I stood on stage at a leadership summit, looking out at a room full of professionals who had, at some point, been told they were too much, too direct, too focused on results. I didn't talk about titles, I talked about clarity. You don't need permission to be valuable, and if the room you're in can't recognize what you bring, then it's not the right room, so build your own. Because the moment you stop waiting to be chosen is the moment you become impossible to ignore. If you would make the same choice I did walking away and building something of your own, then just write discerning, so I know I wasn't alone. Sometimes the hardest decision isn't staying and proving yourself, it's leaving and choosing yourself. Not every door deserves another knock, some are meant to be closed behind you. And when you finally stop chasing recognition, you start creating something far more powerful, your own path. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, someone would eventually notice. that results would always speak louder than anything else. But this experience taught me something deeper sometimes. The room you're in was never built to recognize your value in the first place, and staying there only makes you smaller. Walking away wasn't failure, it was clarity. It was choosing to stop proving and start building. If you've ever felt overlooked, I want you to know your work still matters, even when no one applauds it. And maybe your next step isn't to fight harder, but to move smarter. Now, I'd really love to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation like this? What would you have done? Share your story in the comments, because your voice might help someone else feel less alone. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.